Hello, good morning, and
Hi.
we can start this session that we called conversation and journalism. And Nabeelah, please introduce yourself, and most of all, if you can try to explain what are you doing in the Correspondent as a journalist, and how your job as a journalist has changed when you started working for a such a different newspaper.
So, hi everyone. Thank you for having me, Alberto. Good morning, indeed. I'm actually not that far from you guys. I'm across the border in Slovenia. And I found this in the house today, which I thought was very interesting. Can you see? So let us have the benediction. I'm the conversation editor at the Correspondent, which is an ad-free transnational media platform based in Amsterdam. We just celebrated 1 year. We just had our birthday at the end of September, which is absolutely astonishing, because to be able to work in a journalism platform where it's paid for by members and you don't have any other agenda except trying to explain the foundations of the world that we live in, at least attempting to, and understanding that we're not defined by, the borders that we live in has been an incredible honor. So my background is that I worked at Café Babel, which was a European magazine based in Paris. So I was working in citizen journalism for 7 years. I went from there to The Guardian, where I had the time of my life, and I really worked on the climate change desk there. And trained around the organization. And then I was a freelance reporter where I did a little tiny stint at the Financial Times. I worked at Twitter for a short stint as well. And then I also reflected on digital media platforms, which were transnational, for the Reuters Institute for Journalism based at the University of Oxford. And so when the time came to join the Correspondent, it really was an incredible test to bring together all of this background into a digital media which really knows what it's about. So as I've mentioned before, we're transnational, we're constructive. And when we say constructive, we don't mean that we publish journalism which is happy. It's more that you can present a problem, but you should also try to think about how to present a solution, or to work together with your members to try to think of how you can constructively come to a solution for whatever you're talking about. We're very transparent, especially because we are very open about what our worldview is, and because of that, every correspondent that we have really shares their learning curve. So they explain why they're reporting what they're reporting on, how they hope to work on it with other people who might have a different perspective of that. And together, I think the idea is that you hear different stories. You're not just limited by your own worldview, the only thing that your media has been telling you. We're trying to break that through. And I'm still figuring out what transnational means, because our correspondents at the moment are based in the US, in Egypt, in Nigeria, in India, and in Greece, actually. So whenever we're coming at a topic, we're coming at it from lots of different worldviews. And so I realized this last week when we had our birthday. We had a birthday Zoom chat with the writers. And if you talk about something like the US politics, you can't actually talk about it without talking about what's happening in India with democracy and with the political system, or even wider. So it's definitely a challenge working in this organization, because we're confronting our biases all the time. As the conversation editor, I ensure on a very practical day-to-day level, I'm ensuring that every article that we publish, underneath that article, we have a conversation. And so the idea is to ensure that, because we're the only ones who know our own stories, but we don't know other stories, if you have a problem coming from the worldview that you live in, there might be something across a border which is a solution for you. We're constantly trying to stay open-minded and not use the published article as the end result. We're trying to use that actually as an opportunity to jump to the next idea. And so this is very amazing, because I'm just emailing people constantly and getting in touch with people who I didn't even imagine existed around the world, experts who will join our journalism, but also people who are sharing their lived experience. So for example, it's not just that I'm looking for a doctor in South Korea to explain something of how they do something better. I would say mainstream media are already doing this, right? They're looking around the world for better examples of how to solve their issues. We're also thinking about, if you're a father, in another country, or a mother, I mean, what is your experience like, and how can you bring that to us? And so, I guess you guys have heard of the Membership Puzzle Project. They just published an incredible report around memberful routines. It's really been a pleasure to read it and see how much more common it is to see how newsrooms, as it were, are working with audiences or their readers or their members, because we call our members, exactly what they are. They're funding us to produce a different kind of journalism. And the beats that we publish on, the 5 main ones, are climate, sanity referring to mental health, the first 1,000 days, othering, and better politics. And I would say that the concept of memberful reporting is at its strongest through our sanity and first 1,000-day beats. And so just to give you a few examples, our members, who we look for as experts, they have typically read and commented stories for accuracy before publication. They've given us directions on where we should go for further reporting. And they've joined us live in the conversation under the article to try to further their experiences or expertise. One example I can think of, you all might know Irena Caselli, who's our Italian correspondent. She's the one who's currently based in Greece. And the learning in her journalism has been really, really astounding. She does different series within her beat. So she looks at the first 1,000 days, which you could, in a technical way, call early childhood development. But she explores this as a political act, the political act of birth, or the idea of play. And she's brought together international experts who work on play and childhood. And we've also noticed that the experts who join us for her beat can also cross over to the mental health beat. So we're building communities of concern to understand our world better with a transnational group of people. But we can see that a beat is not only a singular thing. And along the climate beat, we typically bring together people who talk about how we're exposing, the structural origins of the climate justice movement, how climate tech can keep its staying power. And we've also had, if we were to start with the coronavirus economic recovery package, we've tried to bring together people from sociology, but also urban planning and policy. And to make it a bit lighter and not sound so formal, we also have very warm moments and conversations. So you could call them live journalism events, or you could just call it a different way of engaging with writers and helping them fill in a gap where they might, as they say, we have a bias, show us where we might be wrong. One way Irena has done that is by bringing in children onto the platform, so under 18s. And they've explained to us, how they're active in politics, but it's not just children from one particular place. We invited Canadians, Guatemalans, New Zealanders, really just, sometimes there's no place to stop at the Correspondent, because if we're trying to think across borders, there are just so many different systems that you can tap into. We've tried to discuss the anti-colonial struggle with young writers and academics, and we brought together a group of writers from Africa below an article, and the contributions that they provided about the idea of migration and separation were extremely powerful. And we've also spent the last year talking to, lots of other young leaders. So from neuroscientists to climate leaders who are, shaping US policy, for example. And we also have a month, I would say a quarterly book club, where we invite in the writers of books that our members have recommended to us on the othering beat. So one member suggested an anthropologist based in the US who has really explored death on the US-Mexico border. And so the othering beat has really looked at universal themes such as death and birth, or in entire histories of the world. She reread *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari and looked at it from the perspective as an African queer, single mother of one. And so we're constantly trying to break down very common but big themes. And finally, maybe I'll just mention that I work on transnational chats, of which Alberto has been a part of once or twice. And, what kind of people do you want to bring together on your platform? if we're trying to focus on the foundational and the systemic, and who is the most important groups of people that you would bring together who can explain what's happening, so that you can start to see a problem not as something just only specific to your borders, but to a system. And so, for example, I've gathered together privacy experts from around the world who've talked about surveillance. They're trying to make you think about where you start with the core idea of privacy, and they give it to you from their perspective. We've brought together urban planners and architects and housing experts to talk about social justice. And interestingly, when coronavirus started, I was very interestedly looking at our founder and editor-in-chief, Rob Weinberg, and I was just like, so if we're a platform which unbreaks the news and which looks at the foundational, how do we cover coronavirus without being like a typical paper, right? Because people were rushing to cover this story whilst having very little information. And, it was a very unique time. I'm sure you all remember March very well. And so the first thing we did was bring together epidemiologists from all over the world, but not only epidemiologists, people who are working on the medical and misinformation front lines, because all of this was sort of converging into one big triangle. And so the chat that we had actually was just our members logging in, but also people who had a code who were just asking questions. And I was surprised actually at the amount of people who were dealing with misinformation. And so it was very useful to have this panel of people from Hong Kong to the US via Tunisia, who were saying, they were speaking about a common fact, which is the facts that we have and what we know so far. And thanks to that chat, which you could argue sounds like traditional journalism, a member said to me, you really need to think about global health experts. How can you have a chat without bringing together people who actually think about this all the time? And so we followed up about how you can manage COVID-19 with global health experts around the world. And it's just astonishing the direction that you can go in when you all think together about what a story should be, instead of always going to the same people or always following the same stories or following a news trend. If you just, I think what the past year at the Correspondent has taught me, Alberto, you asked, I'm very interested in bringing people to the conversation who wouldn't usually be able to be on a media news platform. I say this as somebody who worked for The Guardian, and I know that we're very idealistic at what we do at the Correspondent, but when I worked on the opinion desk, the war over Crimea was happening. And I wanted to bring all these Ukrainians or Russian-speaking people onto the platform to discuss what was happening there from Crimea. And they just didn't speak English good enough, or their experience was important, but they couldn't formulate it in a way that was beautiful literary prose. And I remember being disappointed because I thought I could do much more if I had such a platform at The Guardian. And I did manage to do a little bit, but the beautiful thing I think about the Correspondent is, although you could say it's limiting because English is the main language, anybody can come and present their view. And I think it's my job in the team to really be looking outside of my own box, because even though I have a Pakistani background and a sort of understanding of the global South, I've been born and raised in the global North. And this is really how I think about the world. I have to be honest about also what I have learned based on what my media systems have taught me or my limited experience of travel. So I think what I have realized is it's just a sort of drop in the ocean of all the different kinds of people that you could be working with. And this is what I'm doing with these live journalism experiments. It's a way of staying open-minded. It's a way of thinking constructively. It's a way of examining your bias. And I think our correspondents are learning that too. In a transnational media, it's okay to locate your experience in a national context. It's okay to make mistakes as long as you continue on the journey together. And I can point you to some of our correspondents who've talked about how they killed a story because the members were challenging them on it or asking them, are you really the best person who can tell us this story? And maybe I'll end actually on one of my favorite moments, which happened in conversation. And this is again with Irena Caselli. And Irena she was talking about how when you're born, some people don't know that they may have been born in extremely extreme circumstances. And she focused on those who were born in Evin prison in Iran. This was based on a documentary about it. And actually, before the pandemic, we were thinking about doing more physical events with our members. And so at the Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam, Irene interviewed Mariam Zari, who's a German Iranian who found out much later from her parents that she was born in the prison. Mariam, in her documentary, spent 3 years looking for other people who were born in this prison. When Irene published her piece about this, a member sent it to another person, a Dutch Iranian, who was born in Evin prison. And this person showed up with her mother at the documentary screening. And all I can say is that all of us were crying so much because it was just so powerful. It's just such a unique story. And I think what we learned from that is no story is too small. You know, I mean, there's just so much that you can be doing if you're working with people and sharing that story and coming together. So I'll end on a highlight there. And I guess I've spoken a lot, so maybe I don't know, Alberto, over to you.
No, please. It's amazing to hear your experience. I don't know how much you know about Italian journalism. I always use this joke about our journalism. I say that Italian journalism shape is white male, old, paternalistic, with the attitude to tell you what's better for you. Please follow me. I know everything about the world, and I'm here to tell you what's the best because I know the best. And I don't know if we truly believe this, or if we pretend that this is working. Actually, it is not working because there is a huge economic crisis. And okay, this premises to ask you, how can you bring a cultural change in the newsrooms, and what kind of mindset do you need to bring this journalism in the newsroom, because it's challenging. I mean, we always work like okay, we have to make 5 or 6 or 10 different proposals to 2 or 3 different newspapers, and then someone get the first proposal. Oh yeah, please do it for tomorrow morning or for tonight, and you have to work in this way, and you don't have time to do this. So how can we manage this? Which are your advices?
That's a really hard one, because I have some understanding of what you're talking about, because when I worked at Café Babel for 7 years, we were pan-European, and we published in 7 languages at one point. So we were in Italian, we were in Spanish, we were in Catalan, we were in French and German. And I was really, really surprised. Although Café Babel was created by Italian journalists, actually, and French journalists, so we had a good basis. I was always very surprised at how it was very hard to be a young, up-and-coming, talented journalist in Italy. This is me speaking anecdotally based on people that I know. And I remember I was in Perugia, really in the early days of the journalism festival, and I saw how one of my colleagues was treated just in a panel as if by an older Italian journalist. And I realized it's a really, really complicated situation. The media structures are something else. Speaking to people who, you know, I mean, freelancers in general know that it's really hard to get paid on time, but to see Spanish journalists not getting paid for 3 months is really something astonishing, and makes you really also believe in the industry, because you are so good at what you do that you're willing to be broke to try to, you know, bring truth to power. These are all the core values I learned at The Guardian, right? Like, what is your job as a journalist? What do you exist to do? What will you not let people get away with, right? I speak from a very privileged space because we're working for a media which has been funded by people. And so we don't even have to, you know, satisfy any ad requirements. It allows us to really serve people the information that they need. But you could argue that what we're doing at the Correspondent, because it's transnational, my fear also is that how would people have time for an unbreaking news platform when, in a time of pandemic and US elections, they just want the news, they just want it served to them. But because of this problem of misinformation and disinformation, I think what we're able to do with such a tiny team is try to really, if everybody's looking in that direction, we're trying to look in the other. And I won't pretend that there are any easy answers out of one country's system of how they run the media, because, you know, we're fully aware that should the pandemic go on and people can't run their businesses, we're also worried about, you know, losing memberships. We've been running for a year, and, you know, let's see how that's going. It's still too early to tell, but This is a challenge with our business model that we're facing too. And I think membership is becoming also a little bit more frequent in other medias around the world, which is fantastic. I know that in the last 6 months, I've paid for more media platforms, which I believe in, and tried to keep them supported, so it's not an easy time. I can only think of my own experience, which is that it seems that it was even hard for me to make it as a journalist in Britain, because it is so competitive, and because the hiring practices are that you tend to hire in Britain somebody in your own image. And it is hard to break through, and the representation is off the charts. If there's this much percentage of, I don't know, Muslims in the country, or this much percentage of minority people, that is not represented neither in our media, nor in our police forces, nor in our institutions, right? So I guess this is a battle that Italy also has to face, how to be more representative in its media. And so for me, it was really important to network and experience other countries and the journalism platforms there. That's harder. I've been asked this question by younger journalists who are just breaking out. How do you do that now when you're not allowed to move around? And I would argue that the online digital industry, I guess, is facing a whole new future where I feel more connected than ever, simply because I'm behind my desk. I speak with the privilege of someone who's connected and networked and met people. That obviously makes it easier, but we're all sharing maybe a more equalized space now to be able to be in touch with each other and stay on the ball about what's important.
I see that we have a question by the audience, and I'd love to have all the questions by the audience they want. So please, Sabrin, go on.
Sorry, I actually have two questions. One is kind of a theoretical one, and one is more like a question of process on how you manage your, not just your members, but the people you decide to involve in your conversation. So, like, the first question I have is your definition of transnational, because I come from an academic background. So at the moment, transnational is a word that a couple of years ago was a very positive one, and now it starts to be criticized because in a way it forgets the post-colonial, and it forgets the consequences. It kind of puts all nations on the same level when it's not really that. There are political and economical pressure that needs to be taken into consideration. So I'm just wondering how you define in your outlet, how you define transnational, how do you approach also the critics against transnational as a label. And then this is the theoretical one. And then the one in the process, right? You said that one of your main goals is to give voices to people that otherwise would not have, they will not be able to be represented in the media. So, and you said that many times you reached out and tried to talk with people and try. So here is another question: is like, I wonder how is the ethical process of all of that. So how do you protect them and involve them rather than not just use them? Because there is another risk that I can see a lot when people are interviewing other people or doing research involving participants. And it's this risk of, okay, I'm writing my piece and I want the opinions because this is what is going to make my piece more valuable. And then after the piece, you just forget like the people you have involved. So my question is like, what is your ethical process in place?
Those are such good questions. So I'll tell you what I think makes sense in my head. Might not be the right answer, but as to the first question of what the heck does transnational mean and how do you approach that as a label? And also it probably answers something that Alberto said before, which is how do you stay sustainable and diverse as a newsroom? I would say that for me, the very strength of working at the Correspondent, and even though we say that we're not supposed to think about borders, we're trying to think across systems and foundations, it matters that our managing editor is Cameroonian. It matters that our journalists are from India and Nigeria and originally Sudan. it does matter that I have a Global South background, and it matters that we have, you know, a really good component of people working in the newsroom who are all from different nations, who are all from different experiences and have traveled. So when Black Lives Matter happened, you know, with the George Floyd killings and the beginning of those protests, you remember it was the beginning of something really massive, because we had all been stuck in we were rooted to the ground because of the pandemic. And it was the first time I was in a newsroom where there was a collective grief and an understanding of why nobody could speak that day. And I found it extremely powerful, because you're working with people who know what people in the world are going through. And it's not that at The Guardian I didn't have this experience, but I have to say that every time there was like a shooting in France, because there was this horrific period when it was happening very often, and I had lived there, and I was standing there as a brown person in the room, and I remember thinking, oh my God, do I have to speak on behalf of why a brown French person might have done something like this, you know? I think this is the power of what we're doing. I think defining transnational also means bringing together, and we're a group of 13 or 14 in the newsroom and distributed around the world. I think it's really important that you bring together people who are challenging that concept of what one worldview looks like. And so our conversations, we meet twice a week for an editorial meeting, and then also we have a meeting where we just talk about how we are. It is the most rooted, powerful thing to work together with a group of thinkers and writers who are bringing to you a different way of looking at things all the time. So that is really impressive and powerful for me. Also about transnational, we're trying to make sure that the sources that we approach for our journalism are not the same global north, white male perspective. That can be really hard to do, because the most interesting specialist who knows about economic recovery might be the guy who's at Stanford, right? Like the system is skewed in a way that all those people are in the UK or the US. But I've really seen, particularly through our mental health beat, Tanmoy, who's based in Delhi, he's really making sure that when he's sourcing people and finding stories and getting his information and basing it on academic research, he's looking for the people who are also the other and who haven't been talked about very often. So we do have this consciousness going right through into our reporting. As for that colonial aspect, we have thought about that. And when we launched at the beginning in last September, we did make sure that we had a special project called Everyday Colonialism. And we talked about this idea. So Everyday Colonialism looked at statues, and it looked at, you know, stories, and it looked at histories. It looked at it from an empirical perspective. And we'll have some good news coming up in the future about how we're continuing that colonial beat. We're actually thinking about it in a different way. And so we're hoping to announce very soon that we have a really exciting new correspondent who'll be taking that colonialism idea into a different direction. But I don't think, especially because this is recorded, I can't tell you. So, because I'm not sure if it has been it's been announced. So please look out for that. It's really exciting. As for the idea of the voices represented in the media, I totally understand you. When we talked about coronavirus recovery, and we talked to global health experts around the world, I looked at the idea of inequality, and one of our members, she's in Ecuador, and she told us that the domestic, I mean, in Ecuador, it was really crazy. It was an epicenter of the pandemic, and it was really a big story that I thought was being missed at the time. She introduced me to a domestic worker. We discussed what conditions were like in a country where actually she was saying that you could just see the morgues were overflowing. So, you know, I could feel that sensationalism of parachuting into a country and then parachuting out. But the important thing was making sure that she could be a part of our community. And so she's not just there to fulfill a quote, because the correspondent doesn't work in that way. The correspondent is building itself along a feeling and trying to get to the true problem of a story, not just, it's a different kind of journalism in that sense, where you're not just trying to build an article, you're really doing something foundational with members, something a bit different. And so she joined our community, and she spoke in Spanish on the platform, and somebody was translating for her. So it's not even that we took her words and put them into English. She actually spoke in her own language, and she was connected in that community with Valerie Hudson, who is this professor in Texas who's written so much about sex and power and gender. And for me, seeing this domestic worker, an incredible trade union representative from Ecuador, speaking directly to a high, like, professor, as it were, in Texas was an incredible moment. And they were discussing, what can you do about this situation? You know, what is the problem? So I think this idea of viable for an article doesn't even like stack up at the Correspondent. It is what we're trying to do inherently is very different, and these people are members of communities. If anything, I would say that we're keeping people out by saying that we're online, by saying that you have to log in. We're imagining that everybody has access to a phone and that they would log in to the, I mean, by its very nature, it's very elitist, I would say, and I don't think the Correspondent would mind if I say that from my perspective. And so a colleague that I worked with she's in Mumbai, she joined us in August for a month, and she helped us with the transnational chat about housing and social justice. And we really discussed this idea that maybe audio is a really great way in the future of hearing from rural farmers or, you know, people around the world who just don't have access to your platform, but who shouldn't be excluded from your media. So there are ideas and there are plans and there are ways to make sure that we're working together rather than, oh, and this lady who's like, you know, in somewhere in Ecuador said this. It's not just a line in a sentence. We're actively working together in a community.
It's very interesting, and I don't know if for Sabrina is okay, the answer, or if you have anything else to ask. I have a question because I had the chance to talk about your project, the Correspondent, with several colleagues, both in Italy and in the Netherlands. And some of the criticizes I've heard deals with the fact that someone perceive you as elitist, someone perceive you as such a niche product, and so that in some way the Correspondent can't scale and can't be as the old newspaper. And another one is that they think that you are overselling the product. So they told me, yes, okay, but we have ever had good journalism. They are not the only ones to make good journalism. And the last one, very interesting for me because I really couldn't get the point, but I want to tell you about this. The last one was an Italian colleague that saw Rob Weinberg's headline about the fact that the US are not a democracy anymore. And he told me, it seems to me just marketing. So these are the criticisms that I've heard about you, and not about you in person, but about the Correspondent. And I'd like to know if you have heard the same ones or other ones, and what do you think about these ones?
Where do I start? I don't quite know, Alberto. Might be feeling slightly. No, I'm not offended. I mean, I don't think any of us is sitting on a like iron throne, because we know that, I mean, especially me in my role, because I'm not writing a beat, I'm facilitating between writers and members. So because I'm constantly at the coalface and on the front line, talking to the actual people who funded us, I think I'm very strongly rooted in reality every day. So I can't speak for Rob or the other journalists in particular. Of course, we're supposed to be staying away from clickbaity headlines, but a thesis that if we're trying to prove something which might be true through our research and through our analysis, which is what we're offering, at least with the US elections, yeah, I guess anybody can take it in any certain way, but it's not to say that criticism is wrong. The very active thing that we're trying to do is build bridges. We have freelance correspondents who write for us about building consensus, or who are writing for us about political literacy. And so it goes to show that we're not at all missing a blind spot in what we're trying to do, because if it can be perceived in a certain way with all the freedom that we have to discuss journalism, we actually have on roll writers who are thinking about what it means to write about politics, or what it means to learn about your political systems, or what it means to not agree with each other, and how do you agree with each other. We're building that all the time. So yeah, actually, I think what I can say, which is not really a defense, but which reassures me, is that we are constantly working in our journalism on the ideas of how to talk about difficult things. I don't know if that answers your question about whether it's easy marketing, or that's a bit harder to say. The point is that you're not excluded if you think that that's wrong. You're invited to come and discuss. It's not to say you come to us, we're the house and we're right. It's like, this is what one thesis that we're proponing. How can we fill in our gaps? Because we have a bias, right? We have a worldview. Rob's worldview is that he has an American passport and his father was born there and he's lived there and he lives in the Netherlands. And I guess he's comparing his view of the US from where he's from. But at no point does the Correspondent as a media lie about its bias. It is honest and telling you what it is. So if the perspective is to take it from there, then we should absolutely be welcome to have those debates. It's not that that person is wrong who thinks that headline might be marketing. It's an invitation to debate.
I mean, at this point, any headline is a marketing tool. And maybe the point is that an headline for me is something like a promise you're making to the audience.
Yeah.
And so if I'm promising you something, and then you can find that my content and my approach and the engagement that I want to have with you is truly consistent with the headline.
Yeah.
So I don't see the point. It's not an issue for me. But it was very interesting because at the same time I know that this kind of people knows perfectly that they are doing the same when they are publishing on Facebook or so on. Talking about tools, do you manage this kind of conversation only on the Correspondent platform, or you manage the conversation also, I mean, in Facebook groups or on other social media's landscapes?
Honestly, myself as the conversation editor, I'm always working. I have a whole space built for me underneath an article. So I'm always very clear that you have to log in and you have to go to the bottom of the article. There's a question that we've created, a conversation opener, as it were. Maybe sometimes there'll be a guest who'll join you in that conversation. But I really use the white space of the platform, which in a way is limiting. But we have a paywall, which is pay as you go, but it's a leaky paywall. So if I share an article with you now, you will be able to read it. That's by design. It's not that you can't read it because you read 3 a month. It's anything. Actually, you could go through the whole website and technically have it read. But this section where people are discussing, we are keeping that behind the paywall, which, as I said, is pay what you want. So it can be as little as $1. But I think even in that sense, people won't really pay $1 to come online and insult you. So this is the difference between the conversation platform and a social media platform, because I think on Facebook or Twitter, of course, we all know this, right? It's really easy to get sidetracked or to not engage with the actual discussion, or, I've been talking a lot to colleagues at the Solution Journalism Network and elsewhere, actually, about how you can engage with somebody and listen to what they're saying, even if you don't agree. And of course, we've been asked this a few times, that we tend to maybe promote one particular view. We're quite liberal or we're quite lefty on the platform, and we're aware of that, and we're trying to have that engagement. So for me, rather than where are all the different places I can engage with people, because we do have an engagement editor, and our engagement editor deals with the daily newsletter, and Imogen, she deals with social media. I particularly am actually interested, and it sounds maybe a bit like blasé, but the art of conversation, which actually is really hard. When Black Lives Matter happened and we wrote a bit more about racism and structural inherent, problems, it was hard to talk to a membership which might not be going through a lived experience of that. It was a challenge. And this is why in the last transnational chat I did, which was last Monday, it was with Irena, but it was also with Patrick Chalmers. And Patrick is a British writer. He's Scottish. He writes about political literacy, and he spent a whole career working at Reuters. And we decided to work with Patrick and work with Irene. We wanted to talk about abortion, but we didn't want the story to be about reproductive rights. We wanted to talk about how do you talk about difficult issues like reproductive rights. And so when we invited groups of people together who talked about what abortion is like in Africa and different countries around the world, what kind of, Ireland is a great success story politically, right? It did a complete U-turn on reproductive rights. And so what I'm trying to do in my job, rather than looking all over the place, I'm trying to work on a topic in a very innovative, unique way. And so we actually had this discussion for 30 minutes last Monday on the platform where this is the story of reproductive rights. And this is also a group of people who are not experts in that, but who talk about how democratic innovations can help you bring something so important to change in your country. And Ireland is the biggest example of that, because it did a complete U-turn in a very conservative country, had a prime minister who didn't believe in it, and then he changed his mind. And so we're interested in the power of citizens broadly. And so we were able to discuss an issue in a non-traditional way, I thought. It was really amazing. So, yeah.
In some way, it seems that by design and also by how people react to this design choice, you are telling journalism is not only, please take this article and read it, but the most valuable part is the conversation. I mean, the conversation is under the paywall. The hard paywall is the conversation, and people in the chat can experience what you told before. I sent you an URL, the link of a conversation, and since I'm a member of the Correspondent, you can read it for free, but you can't join the conversation. Mm. So, did you discuss this? Is it true that journalist value is the conversation and the engagement, the relationship with readers, and not the content?
Well, it's a difficult one, because sometimes when I contact members, especially when we were talking about inequality during the pandemic, and I contacted a man in Chicago who's working with local shelters, and he was like, but this is elite. This is not elite. He said, this is private and this is not open to everyone. And I said, actually, I can produce a code which people can use. I mean, I usually try to do this where you can actually access the conversation and have access to the Correspondent and join. I think it's limiting for now, because I'm a one-woman team. So definitely if zillions of people are contributing all the time, which is possible were it to be open, I don't think I could stay on top of it. Equally, I don't really see my perspective as a moderator here, because we trust adults to say what they think can be true, and we have community guidelines, and the idea is that you speak to each other online as you would offline, and all of these very slightly maybe patronizing ideas of how to keep a conversation going, which is why we emphasize, if you have something to say, which people do usually have something to say, as you guys might know in an Italian system, please can you only share if you have experience or expertise, or if you have something else to say, maybe really think about it constructively. What do you want to learn about if you have this really violent opinion of how, I don't know, cops aren't killing everybody? I don't know, very tense topics, but how we can come together and think about it. So yeah, I don't know, conversation, it's something that we're developing and we're really thinking about, but it is also the content, because our beats, one of the series that we're doing is political literacy, as I mentioned. How can it be that you can be, I don't know, a 50-something-year-old veteran journalist, and Patrick is saying, I don't know anything about politics, actually. I don't even know how to begin. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the roots of democracy, and let's talk about what this system is. He's bringing you back through a very complicated time where you're asking people to vote in the US, and the system is almost against you. That's what our Better Politics editor says as well, right? Her beat about better politics is how to help you see through what the true story might be and not be distracted by everything that's going on right now. And equally, we have a series called Fixing the Future, where we've invited guest writers to really think about how do you fix problems which affect us all. And so we've heard from Yanis Varoufakis, we've heard from Jason Hickel, we've heard from economic anthropologists and thinkers from around the world on how you can actually work to build a fairer society. But it's not just that they tell you what they think. They're trying to bring their communities in so that you can also share your ideas with them of what is a good way forward. we published an article. We're publishing a series of articles by a Dutch anthropologist who's talking about base materials, and he's just like, how can we live in a world with concrete or steel or fertilizer, and all of these things are actually not the most sustainable options, but we build our whole universe on it, quite literally. It's really interesting seeing members talking to him and saying, this is an alternative to fertilizer, which actually is feeding 2 out of 5 people in the world, but it's killing us in a long-term ecological perspective. This is an alternative to it. To have conversations about fertilizer on the platform is so random, but really, really impressive, because we're trying to attract lots of different people in a more solutions mindset. So I would look at it that way, like content and conversation, they're working in symbiosis. They're not just, I guess, isolated events.
Have you ever had a conversation with, climate change deniers or Trump voters or Brexit voters or very polarized conversation, and how it happens? Because if I have to think about your audience, I don't think about them as climate change deniers or Trump voters, but maybe it's by bias, I don't know.
When I interviewed for the Correspondent, and they were like, what would you do if you had a climate change denier? And I was like, no, they don't get a place on the platform, because I came from The Guardian and we spent a year working on climate change, and we actually did a climate change campaign. We just slightly were just bordering the line of whether we were journalists or activists. You know, we were really trying to say, climate change is happening. This is where our stance is. If you don't believe it, we do have like blog system where you can hear different perspectives, but that perspective is not one we are taking. This is our stance, and sometimes news medias have to take that stance and say, this is not real. So I was really surprised when I encountered 1 or 2 climate change deniers on the platform who were, let's say, older members. We're not allowed to have all the data of who our members are, so I actually just meet them as their full names, which is their real names, which you have to publish under on the platform, because if our writers publish under their real name, we expect you as a contributor to as well. And that was really challenging. But what's very fascinating is someone might publish a climate change denying perspective or something which doesn't believe in it, and then other members come and say, this is why you're wrong. I don't think it's a waste of time to always leave that to the members to say yes, no, but it is really interesting to see engagement on the topic and an understanding of why you might be mistaken, because we want you to use the facts, and these are the facts. And that is really interesting, but we do have climate change deniers on the platform. Not 1 million, but a couple, and it's interesting. And I've got, a couple of members who are from the south of the States who have really strong views, and we talk. It is hard sometimes because we're also humans. We don't see each other. We can't look at each other in the eyes like we are now. We can't discuss. I can't hear their intonation. Racism is a really complicated one, I think, for us. But we are really working on it. So definitely we have challenges. I wouldn't say every member thinks exactly the same as us, but all of this stuff does exist. And we try to not block it. I haven't yet deleted a member because they did or said something wrong. There may have been one racist word which I was just like, this I can't publish. So either you edit or I'm going to have to take it out. But there's always a dialogue.
I have to say that this is my dream about journalism. But I have to ask you the last question, if the audience has no questions anymore. And the last question is, do you think this is sustainable on the long term?
In what way?
In the economical way, of course.
I'm
sorry, but we have to talk about money too.
Yeah. It's definitely, I would say that the average donation from a member, I think, is quite I can't think of the number because I'm never really reviewing the data. We're very data friendly when you're working in editorial, which I like because it means that you're not biased about who you're talking with or what you are. I definitely think that we saw what some media organizations saw at the beginning of the pandemic, which was a peak. More memberships, people saying, I want something reliable. But of course, as people's businesses are affected, and of course, as we had a crowdfunding campaign, that was our first year of our media platform. And so we're still working to renew memberships, and that is definitely a challenge. We're trying to figure out more how to retain memberships. And we've understood that the best way to do it for now, we have got enough money to go through for year number 2. The question is, how do you keep focusing that on your journalism? So I'm very lucky to not be working in that field where I'm having to worry about that, because the Correspondent was born out of De Correspondent, which is the Dutch media organization, which is now celebrating 7 years of working in the same business model. But it's much easier for them, I think, because they're working within a national context, within a national language. And what we're trying to do is something very transnational and different. So I would say that it's not an easy challenge, but we have got enough to keep going for year number 2. So we're still, because we just turned 1 at the end of September, we're still getting renewed memberships. The people who joined us for year number 1, are they willing to join us for year number 2? The only way that I have been, asked to keep focusing on keeping them is to keep working on the journalism. So that sounds very purist, but it's an adventure and we're still going on it. But of course, I mentioned earlier my own fears for what can happen when you can't afford to pay for an unbreaking news platform. And I think we're just staying really aware about it, because we're also being very transparent about where we're coming from, which is idealism. And so we're idealistic. We think that this is the way we can write about stories. And I think this is also something that members who might like what we do might also be saying, I agree with you, and I want to help you go forward on this. So you stick to your principles, you stick to your values, and you keep doing it for as long as you can. And I can say that for now, we can keep going for year number 2.
Wow. We have actually a question by the audience. So Giorgio wrote, I drive a small hyperlocal project based in Sicily. At the Sicilian Post, we are focusing on local stories. And we have both an Italian and English edition. Actually, we are offering free contents, and we are still evaluating different paywalls and alternative business model. And the question is something of the Correspondent model declinable in a hyperlocal context?
So Sicily, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That's really interesting. Oh, hi. That's
Hi,
great.
Giorgio.
What you guys are doing. I couldn't say for hyperlocal, because the Dutch Correspondent is working on a nationwide perspective. So my only good role model is them, and they are doing really well. They have really brought on correspondents who are focusing on very different topics which resonate with the population. So they just brought on new correspondents to write about the theory of food, or trans rights, or I don't know, what was the pharmaceuticals correspondent, who is doing a really great job talking about COVID-19. So in terms of models and what we're doing, I'm not so well versed in hyperlocal at the moment, because I'm always focusing on what we're doing as on a membership scaling to a country. We're trying to scale membership to the world. So there are, of course, Alberto's mentioned the Bristol Cable, who are doing an amazing job, but I have to say I'm not keeping eyes on what's going on there. But I think if you're hiring the right people who are talking about the right issues, then I think that really works in a community level. My favorite example from the UK, also apart from the Bristol Cable, is the Bureau Local, where they're really working with people together. Like, you're invited to join a group in your community who are learning how to do freedom of information requests, to find out very basic things about how your community is run. And I think in that sense, the journalism is also in educating community members and learning journalistic skills to then really call truth to power. So I don't know if that's what you're doing with the Sicily Post. What is your raison d'être?
Sicilian Post is a culture magazine, but we are doing some in-depth article all about Sicily. It's not just lifestyle, but unfortunately. So we have started an English edition. It's a prototype of an English edition to experiment, to bring out our stories outside of the Sicily, because the Sicily is the island on the Mediterranean, or most important in migration crisis. So we will experiment in that sense. Thank you.
No, it's nice to hear from you. And I think when it comes to memberful routines, you should definitely check out the Membership Puzzle Project. They did this huge report with so many case studies from how locally organizations around the world are working with their members to try to, and if this is a model that you're trying to go for, there are so many tips and structures and processes of how to work with people to produce something of value for your own network. So I would definitely check that out as a start.
Okay.
And I would add an advice. Try to see how many different roles in the newsroom you can find different from the traditional journalistic role. I mean, if you see the roles in the Correspondent, for example, it's amazing, because even Nabeelah is doing something that in the Italian newsrooms is completely unthinkable. We don't have conversation editors, and we don't have engagement editors, and so on. Okay, so Nabeelah, I'd like to thank you very much, because it was a great pleasure for me to have you here. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and please say hello to everybody in the newsroom, and I hope to can continue the conversation with you, because it's very interesting.
It was so nice to meet you all, and thank you for your great questions, Sabrine and Giorgio. So great to hear about your initiative. I've shared the Membership Puzzle Project, Memberful Routines, which is like a goldmine for ideas for how to really think constructively and positively. And I've also shared 2 articles where we talk about how we did an editorial report and a financial report for full transparency with our members, and we published them. So I would encourage you to look at them as a way of seeing how we navigated, how we spent the money from our membership, and how we have editorially done, because it's really interesting. And maybe, I mean, it sounds very boring when I say it's a report, but actually it's transparency. It is approaching something in a very peculiar way. So
sounds so interesting. It's not boring.
Thank you so much, and see you soon.